In this tutorial, we will deal with 3D area mapping. I created a project in a 1 to 10 scale, and there is a loaded object in a 3D display. And when I switch to the 2D display, a corresponding model view unwrapping has already been generated here. The handling of mapping classes and mapping groups is like in the 2D mapping. That is, I have imported a project here as a template where I created the group's precondition and treatment. In a group, all my model views are already there. If I want to change that, I just go to my group management, select my group precondition, go to mapping basis, and can now choose the container totem here. I do the same for the treatment group, then go on to accept. If I select my groups here, then the corresponding display is prepared. Here you can really transfer a lot of things that you know from 2D mapping into 3D mapping. I switched my 3D object in a 3D display, and I now take my first mapping class here and actually see in the third column the same drawing commands as I know it from 2D mapping. We will just play through it one at a time and go into a few specifics. The first feature is, of course, the question of display control. With the left mouse button, I can move my object, and with the right mouse button, I can rotate it. And if I double click on the left of my object interface, then we move the rotation center to the point where I set my double click. So I can rotate in here in detail and then select my corresponding drawing command. And then here I have my polygon command. I have my free line here. I got my cubic spline. And I can also connect these commands together, same as in 2D mapping. That means I start with the polygon, I press the tab key and can switch between drawing commands. I activate the cubic spline and can now go back to the polygon command. So these are the things that you can apply in the 3D area mapping as well as in 2D area mapping. Now that I have made my first entries here, I can switch to the 2D display and see that the program automatically checks which elements are visible in which model view. But in the table on the right, I see that the green areas are marked as 3D mapping areas. I can also choose them, can display the marked ones with double-clicking the view. I could also execute corresponding mapping commands in the view, but I have to make sure that I do this only in the areas where I'm relatively orthogonal to the display. So I have the option up here to say I switch between 2D, 3D, or automatic. I go to 3D here and take my polygon here, and now I can draw a surface here too. If I now switch to the 3D display, then I see here that the surface is also intersected with the 3D object. So during 3D mapping, it's always good to use the spacebar to interrupt the drawing command. That means I have chosen my spline here, I press the spacebar and double click here left and can draw my new entry here. Right mouse button to close. I press back to my overall object display. I can navigate to a new position, double left click, release spacebar, and can draw a new area. What is a problem, or more correctly, what is not yet implemented? I can touch individual elements with the tool hammer, but at the moment I do not have the possibility to move individual points in the 3D display. This will come at a later date. With escape, I can deactivate the area again. I can mark them again, right mouse button, and can now move one area to another class. I choose another class and say accept. So from the handling of the 3D display, there are also differences, like where do I put my points? I now choose the polygon command and consciously draw outside of my 3D object. And then with this command, the whole object is cut. That is, if I press spacebar afterwards and turn around the object, I see that it has selected all the triangles in the selection for this area. And when I do something like this, I can see here I have a certain perspective. So I revert a step back, I delete the area, and now switch to ortho projection. And I go back to the view on UCS 01 and now apply the same command again, but in the orthogonal view. I close with right mouse button, and then I can see now that I don't have a perspective in it, but I'm orthogonal to the view. So we go back to the front view, and now I make a combination that I put individual dots next to the object and then start mapping on the object. And then right click to close. Now all the triangles that are selected in this area are obtained. I press the space bar and turn and see that it has mapped the area to the back. I can use this if I look at this hand here. Then I could mark an area here as a mapping object. And see the result. We don't yet have the ability to edit surfaces on a single point basis. That is, if I want to expand or shrink areas now, then we have the option of the auto mode, which we already know from 2D mapping. That means I choose the auto mode in the fourth column, select it and have the option plus and minus. That is, if I choose the plus and take the command spline, then I can draw a new surface, a new contour. Right mouse button to close the surface, and the area is expanded accordingly. I can do the same with minus, so that I can correct or change the contours of areas in this way. I also have the merge commands of objects from different classes. So I choose a second mapping class. I draw here deliberately over the existing area here. And then I can select the area with the tool hammer and select the cutting command minus and select the second area. And then I have a common cutting polygon here. The display order, as in which contour line is shown above, is also handled as in 2D mapping. I can select the individual mapping class at the top of the mapping tree, can drag the one with the left mouse button up. Then the magenta contour line is drawn over the green. And I can turn it around depending on what is more important to me for the presentation, which class should appear more dominantly in the foreground. Everything I do here in the 3D mapping, I also have in a 2D display. So here I see the magenta area under the green area. In contrast to metigo map version 4.0, I can now work with hatching in version 5.0. That means I can go to the class management here and can also assign a corresponding hatching to the existing mapping classes. I'm going to pick a hatching here. Let's take a grid. And choose the second class. Say apply. Then I can see here in the 2D display my hatching. Maybe I'll dial back the transparency a bit. So I mark all classes, go to 20%. So I can see the hatching better. And I can now go to the 3D display and change my view with the spacebar pressed. Then you can see here at the area drawing, I have certain movements with the representation of the hatching. And there are display options for this. We have three settings here. I can project the hatching on an image plane, and then the display is parallel to the currently selected display projection. I can align them firmly in the image plane, or I can align them to the element. Then the hatching doesn't seem to move, but then I have these kind of effects with the hatching that goes around corners. In itself, it doesn't really matter which display option you choose, because if you switch to the 2D display, then the hatchings as we know it from 2D mapping are simply chosen orthogonally to the display plane. That is, if I choose a line with 60 degrees to the left, it will be displayed as this regardless of the option as set in the 3D mapping.